Hello there, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today we shall review the Admiral Hipper for you, and this is the new German heavy cruiser for the German Navy. I already did some first impressions on those ships, on all the new cruisers in particular in patch 1.91, but this was more to present you anything, to give you a first rough understanding of the ship's capabilities. While I already ran down some numbers, it is really this review that is a proper review. The first impressions are more a foreplay or a prelude, if you will, and I said that we will review the ship because also, I have a 5-minute guide for you by the ever awesome Drachinifel that shall just enlighten you on the historical career of this particular ship. So, I have some gameplay for you, some spectacular gameplay, if I may say so myself, and I think that this ship shines in one or two aspects. It is not the complete dictator of the meta, if you will, but it certainly has its place, and used right on the right maps, in the right circumstances, this ship is an absolute monster, but it also has its weaknesses. So I shall present you its strengths and weaknesses, how to use the strength, how to abuse the weaknesses if you play against it, and I think without further ado, let's hop right into the 5-minute guide.
The Admiral Hipper class were one of the first Kriegsmarine units to be built fully under the control of the Nazi Party. The Versailles Treaty had limited the German Navy, as we've already seen, but as well as the battleship tonnage restriction, cruisers were limited to 6,000 tons, which had resulted in the Königsberg class. However, in the 1930s, the London Naval Treaty formally split heavy and light cruisers, along with the 10,000-ton upper limit on displacement, and in 1935 Hitler concluded the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which, along with pulling out of the terms of Versailles, left the Kriegsmarine with 50,000 tons of heavy cruiser displacement to fill, or 5 ships. Shortly before the formal signing, the design for the Admiral Hipper class had been prepared, with the class running at 3 ships: Admiral Hipper, Blücher, and Prinz Eugen. 2 other ships, Seydlitz and Lutzow, were planned as effectively the German answer to the British Town class, being Hipper-type hulls, but with 4 triple turrets carrying 5.9-inch guns. But by 1936 it was decided to build all 5 as heavy cruisers. As with the Deutschland class, the building process was a learning experience, and the first 3 ships were all of slightly different dimensions, with the last 2 being identical, but to a 4th set of dimensions that was slightly larger again. Capable of 32 knots, the armament of the ships consisted of 4 twin turrets equipped with 8-inch guns, with 2 turrets superfiring forward and a matching pair aft. The secondary battery had 12 dual-purpose 4.1-inch guns in twin mounts, with a dedicated anti-aircraft armament of 12 37mm and 8 20mm guns. Wartime service would see a variety of additional 40mm and 20mm guns added to the ships in service for a variety of numbers, often with a 37mm removed to make room. Finally, 12 torpedo tubes in 4 triple launchers were added, with 2 launchers per side, with 1 full reload of torpedoes carried as well as those in the tubes. A main belt of just over 3 inches thickness with a 2-inch deck provided some limited protection, and this all added up to a considerable displacement of between 16 and 17,500 tons depending on the ship. It does raise questions about the efficiency of the design, similar to those surrounding the design of Bismarck. The ships were 60 to 70% over the displacement limit, yet compared with ships that were actually pretty much on the displacement limit, it's difficult to see where all this extra weight comes from. Compared to the British County class and the American New Orleans class, all 3 classes are about the same speed, and all have similar main batteries, although the New Orleans manages to get an extra gun in. In terms of secondary batteries, the New Orleans carries slightly fewer but larger dual-purpose guns and no torpedoes, while the Counties carry a slightly lighter overall dual-purpose and anti-aircraft battery, but not by much, and they do carry 8 torpedo tubes. So you might think that the overall greater number of secondary guns are the factor here, but both Allied ships are significantly more heavily armoured, which would more than balance that factor out. Overall, it seems to come down to the fact the Hippers were about 20 metres longer than the other 2, which would have extended the overall length the armour had to cover. As such, and similar to the Bismarck, whilst competitive with their treaty equivalents, there was certainly room for improvement in the efficiency of the design. The 5 ships were started between 1935 and 1937, and the first 3 would come into service in 1939 and 1940. Blücher had the shortest active career, pronounced ready for service on the 5th of April 1940, and at the bottom of the ocean 3 days later, thanks to the obsolete Norwegian Oscaborg fortress. A fortress so old the Germans had written it off as unimportant, since of course it was used for training and manned by a commanding officer who was actually a pensioner who'd retired 13 years ago, in charge of a bunch of trainees. It was armed with Whitehead torpedoes that predated the HMS Dreadnought and similarly obsolete guns. It turned out, however, that this wasn't quite so toothless as it might appear, and the fortress sent the Blücher to the bottom with a pair of 11-inch shells, a bunch of shells from their lighter guns, and a salvo of the obsolete torpedoes. The direct result was the temporary retreat of the German fleet, and the escape of the Norwegian government and gold reserves. I think that Blücher as a name for German ships is probably cursed. Seydlitz was almost complete in 1940 when work was paused, and in 1942 some genius decided to cut most of that away and try and make it into a light aircraft carrier called Weser. That went about as well as you'd expect, and the Soviets found her incomplete scuttled hull in 1945. Lutzow had even more fun. She was sold in 1940 to the Soviet Union, while still incomplete, and renamed Petropavlovsk. She would actually end up fighting against the Germans in defense of Leningrad until she was sunk by the Germans, then raised in 1942, renamed to Tallinn, and used to break the ongoing siege of Leningrad before being used as a floating barracks ship until being scrapped in the 1950s. The Admiral Hipper had marginally better luck, surviving the invasion of Norway at the cost of being rammed by HMS Glowworm, which had been fighting a German destroyer. An attempt to commerce raid in the Atlantic failed when the engine oil caught fire. A second attempt was more successful in that they actually got into the Atlantic, then ended up attacking a convoy with a heavy escort, getting into a gunfight with the County-class HMS Berwick, and falling back to France. A final raid was much more successful, sinking a number of ships before heading for Germany for repairs and then being deployed to Norway. After taking part in the abortive attack on convoy PQ-17, the next major action was the Battle of the Barents Sea, during an attempt to attack the convoy JW-51B. During this engagement with the ex-Deutschland, now Lutzow, Hipper engaged a pair of Town-class cruisers and, despite the overwhelming firepower advantage, ended up withdrawing with damage. This particular incident led to Hitler ordering the scrapping of the entire German surface fleet, and although most of this order was later rescinded, the Admiral Hipper was decommissioned and was eventually scuttled after being bombed in May 1945. The remaining ship, Prince Eugen, will be getting its own video, as it seems to have vampirically absorbed all the good fortune from the rest of the class.
Let's now have a look at the ship in port in War Thunder, and as usual let's begin here with the armor, and let's begin with the hull. The hull has a distributed armor scheme, and that means that the very tip of the bow has 20 and 40 millimeters respectively. That means it is protected from most likely 5-inch high explosive shell fire here, which reduces the risk of flooding and also is overall responsible for not getting set on fire that often. But versus 6-inch light cruiser and heavy cruiser high explosive fire, this section is still vulnerable. The main armor belt though begins just under the front forward turret and ends at the rear turret, and is 80 millimeters thick. That is not the strongest protection that there is in War Thunder, even in patch 1.91, but we'll get to this in just a moment. The rear end is an extended 70 millimeter main belt section, and it is rounded up with a 70 millimeter bulkhead. So that means that we come back to the main armor belt, and the setting point is of course the turtleback armor array, and that means that you have an internally angled belt that then again can ricochet penetrating AP rounds that have not that much kinetic energy left. It also absorbs a lot of splinters and shrapnels from penetrating shells, and it also reduces the thickness or the size of the rather thin deck here at 30 millimeters. But also when it comes to long range fire, then plunging fire from steep angle can bypass the main belt and can go through the inclined armor that then de-angles itself. So that is also a risk, but at close quarters this is efficient, especially versus small caliber fire from destroyer armor piercing, etc. Versus other cruisers, the ship's strength lies when it is angled bow in, and then the risk of plunging fire, but also of shells passing through here, then the effective thickness of the 80mm belt is greatly reduced. There is still a chance that a shell goes through here this 40mm part by overmatching it and then going through the front bulkhead of 80mm, but that is a rather small, slim target, and other ships have this weakness actually in a greater chance, if you will. Now let's come to then the middle of the ship, and we have here a twin 20mm plating that further reduces damage to the machinery, and also we have then an upper deck that ranges from 14mm and starts at the front turrets and also the rear turrets, then a middle section of 20mm, and the actual middle section is then 25mm thick. So then we come to the main battery turrets themselves, and their barbettes is 80mm thick. That is not as thick as, for example, the Brooklyn's 6-inch barbette, or 152mm if I remember correctly, but especially it is very helpful versus, again, destroyer AP at long range, but especially versus high explosive fire. Then the turrets themselves also have the great advantage of being armored, the turret faces being 160mm, again very comparable to the Brooklyn class, which has 165mm. But remember, this is all rolled homogeneous armor. Only the turret faces are rolled cemented armor, making them a bit more effective in absorbing AP shells. And this shows in battles. I think I only got knocked out some gun barrels, but never really an entire turret, maybe 1 or 2 times. But even under high explosive spam from enemy light cruisers and heavy cruisers, the turrets never went down. It only had to take a direct AP shot, and even then you still have 3 turrets left that are particularly difficult to knock out. Also very difficult to knock out is here the conning tower, aka the bridge. That means you always have full control over your ship. It's a small target, it is heavily armored with 150mm, and for it to be knocked out it requires good aim at long range, and a lot of people then aim more for the hull rather than the high bridge. So this keeps the ship in fighting condition for much longer in comparison to, for example, the Japanese heavy cruiser line that have unarmored turrets, or very lightly armored turrets, shall I say. So the armor scheme is not all that bad, but again, especially when it comes to the thin plating armor layout, we have the problem that a lot of those plates are relatively thin, and while they can still ricochet normal armor piercing shells versus the Soviet semi-armor piercing that functions more like, in tank terms, APHBC rounds, they just have this magic ability to pass through all this armor, and then one of those lucky freak shots goes, even when you're angled, straight through your armor, and then also ignites the magazines. But versus all other enemies, you have quite a decent resistance. That means you need to focus on Soviet ships. And let's come now to the interior, and we can see that we have one big downside, and that is this fuel tank. Because it can happen, even if this long fuel line gets damaged, this one in particular seems to, let's zoom out. This one seems to burn quite often, and a lot of people aim for your magazines, miss them, and ignite this fuel tank. This then ignites this fuel tank, and this fuel tank is below the magazines, and fuel and magazines, that's not a, let's just say that's a very potent high explosive combination. So you have to be really focused here on your fire extinguishing. Your crew dies like flies, and those are just the main magazines, and they are more or less the same on the front as they are on the rear. And they are partially above the waterline, but still below the turtleback armor array. But that makes them very relying on the armor working rather than the shells kinetic energy getting absorbed by several meters of water. So then there is a huge machinery complex in the middle of the ship, and then also the screws. They sometimes get damaged, but not that often. And one further drawback here are the midships magazines for the 4.1-inch anti-aircraft batteries, or the 105mm, of which you have quite a few, and they are also here. So the ship has a lot of sturdiness versus high explosive shells. Versus armor piercing, it also can put up a fight, especially when heavily angled, especially bow in. But you should not rely on it, and you also always should focus on the enemy big guns and take them under effective fire. And how effective your fire is, well, let's just compare this ship in another perspective. So now let's try to bring the ship into somewhat of a perspective versus its 5.7 battle rating cruiser competition of other nations, and immediately we can see that the Admiral Hipper has the least amount of guns with only 8, but has the joint highest caliber with 203mm, aka 8-inch. So the Admiral Hipper has 8 203mm 60 SKC-34 guns. Very important that we come back to this specific type of guns later. We have a decent amount of ammunition, a bit more than the Kirov, but a bit less than the Mogami, but you ran never out of them in battle. That is down to the amount of guns and due to their reload of 12 seconds, 3 less than the Mogami, which is very helpful, but 1 more than the Kirov, which has smaller guns. The effective DPM therefore is 40 rounds per minute. That is the same as the Mogami and a bit less than the Kirov and significantly less than the USS Brooklyn and Southampton, but the Brooklyn and the Southampton are light cruisers with 6-inch guns respectively. The huge difference that the Admiral Hipper has here to the Mogami and the Kirov is that it keeps this DPM, because the Kirov in particular really suffers from knocked out main batteries, and that really makes it very much less efficient under stress, under enemy fire, even from destroyer high explosive. Now let's come to the torpedoes. The G7As, of which this ship has 12, have an average caliber of 533mm, and with the torpedo mode, which is very important, you have a range of 14,000 meters, 14 kilometers, but only with a speed of 56 kilometers per hour. That is rather slow, comparable to the HMS Southampton's Mark 9s, and that means they are more like floating mines. You have 12 overall of them, but only 6 per side you can launch, and it takes a while before you can swing the ship around. So from those 2 triple launchers, you can only lock down a certain area. And maybe the speed is an advantage because the torpedoes then stay a threat for much longer and ship has to avoid this specific area. Then let's look at the displacement of the ship, and we are by far the heaviest ship with over 18,000 tons. The top speed with 60 kilometers per hour, it's not by far not the fastest. This one goes to the Kirov with 67 kilometers per hour, but it certainly is no slouch and is more or less standard. The crew is also very large with 14,000, but they heavily suffer from fire damage, and when you receive a magazine hit, all your crew is not all that useful when the entirety of the ship explodes. Let's now quickly talk about the ammunition that this ship has actually access to, and those are 3 different shell types. We begin with the stock HE, the 20,3 cm L4,7 KZ-HE. It is a 122 kg heavy warhead that travels at 920 meters per second from the muzzle onwards, and this high muzzle velocity has several big advantages. It gives the enemy less time to dodge, you have to take less aim, and especially at long ranges, this increases your accuracy or hit ratio quite considerably. And you have even enough blast penetration to punch big holes into enemy thin belt armor that is less than 61 millimeters. That causes then a lot of flooding, and with 8.8 kilograms of TNT filler, you also cause considerable damage to destroyers and also lightly armored cruisers. In fact, the only ship that has a shell that offers more blast penetration but also more TNT filler overall is the Kirov with its smaller guns, carrying a whopping 12.2 kilograms of TNT. The second shell type is the tier 1 upgrade, which is the AP round, and in this case it's an AP CBC round, a bit more precise. It is the 20,3 cm L4,4 mit Haube APBC. So this shell travels again at a mass velocity of 925 meters per second, and that results in the 122 kilogram heavy warhead having a massive penetration value of 430 millimeters. That is quite a difference to the other ships, is even the Mogami and the Kirov, but the real magic kicks in at 10 kilometers, where this shell keeps its penetration value much more and doubles the penetration value of the nearest competitor, the Kirov, with 261 millimeters of raw penetration. That is massive, and that allows you to punch through belt armor, through angled armor, and through deck armor, even at long ranges. The TNT equivalent of the bursting charge with 2.65 kilograms of TNT is not the highest. This again goes to the Mogami, and even the Kirov has more, but the difference is not that massive. Due to the fact that you have this massive velocity, you don't have to give that much lead. Your dispersion is most of the time pretty okay. The enemy has less time to dodge. That results in more hits, and one of them goes straight through the ammo rack, as you can see in the gameplay right behind. I ammo rack quite a few enemy cruisers. I always go and aim for the area below the turrets, and that is the easiest and most consistent way of taking out enemy cruisers. Versus destroyers, this shell is not all that great. That comes from the two facts that you have a fuse sensitivity of 10 millimeters, and a lot of destroyers don't have this kind of armor, and you also have a fuse delay of 9 meters, meaning even if you arm the fuse on the side of a destroyer, the shell punches clean through. But this is an anti-bigger ship weaponry. This is perfectly designed to take care of enemy cruisers, and even if you miss the magazines, you still do a considerable amount of damage to the machinery, knock out the pumps, the steering, the propulsion, etc. The third shell type is then a tier 2 upgrade, and that is the 20,3 cm L4,7 Bodenzünder mit Haube high explosive. So this is your base use HE basically, and it has also very similar stats. 122 kilogram heavy warhead traveling at an initial mass velocity of 925 meters per second. Now the difference is that it produces the same kinetic energy penetration at close range than the stock HE, but it has considerable less bursting penetration of only 43 millimeters in contrast to the 61 that the stock HE has, and that comes from a considerable less TNT equivalent filler of 5.35 kilograms, and you also have a fuse sensitivity of 0.1 millimeter. But the fuse delay is 5 meters. Again, this shell is surprisingly underwhelming even versus destroyers, but also doesn't have really that much to offer versus cruisers. This is not the semi-armor piercing coming from the high explosive side, rather than the SAP coming from the AP side with more TNT filler. I would not really recommend this shell. I think that the combination of the stock high explosive versus destroyers or superstructure of enemy cruisers in combination with the AP for the ammo racking or going through the belt armor of enemy ships is much more reliable. You have to decide yourself for two shell types, and the stock HE and then the tier 1 upgrade, the AP. Those are your shell types. They are very efficient, they deal out the damage, they are reliable, they hit fast, they hit hard, and they are really efficient at knocking out enemy gun systems, at knocking out enemy crew, knocking out internal modules, and ultimately giving you a lot of kills. And your armor keeps the firepower up there and out there. This is a very efficient, long range, very stable firing platform for those guns. At the end of the video, only one question remains: how exactly do you now play this ship? Well, first of all, if you spawn, you immediately try to angle in towards the enemy. You prioritize the enemy heavy cruisers and light cruisers that are shooting you, that are focusing you, and after you have dealt with them with the appropriate use of high explosive and armor piercing respectively, you then prioritize the most potent threat for the rest of your team, aka the Kirov, aka the Chapayev, and then also the Japanese heavy cruisers, and also then the Brooklyn and the Southampton, because they have armor. You have a very, very efficient armor piercing shell in this patch. This ship in patch 1.91 is the absolute long range armor piercing king, like it previously was the German light cruiser of the second light cruiser wave, the Köln. But this ship is just so much more fun and effective in that role, and yet randomly you can explode with the first shell that gets sent your way. If an enemy Hipper hits you or shoots at you, you only can hope that he doesn't hit your magazines and or your turrets, and that you have to take him down before he takes down you. The ship is also very vulnerable to fire damage, and also you have to watch out for enemy aircraft. Don't completely isolate yourself. Always watch out that there are some pretty potent anti-aircraft cruisers, either the British or the Americans or certain Soviet ships are nearby, because you don't have proximity fuses for your anti-aircraft batteries, and also your mid and short range AA isn't that effective. There are better ships out there in this respect. But as an anti-ship ship, the Admiral Hipper is probably the best that there is at this very moment in patch 1.91. In the future, the Americans and the British, hopefully, and to be expected, also get their heavy cruisers, and how their 8-inch shells stand up to the German 8-inch has to be seen. And even within the German tech tree amongst the heavy cruisers, the Admiral Hipper at some point will get outclassed for sure by the 11-inch, aka 283mm carrying Deutschland class of pocket battleships, aka heavy cruisers that have battleship grade guns. So that is now the review on the Admiral Hipper. I personally absolutely love this ship, but other ships also have their point. This ship is not the dictator of the meta, but it has its place. And depending on the map, depending on the team composition, depending on the focus of the enemy team, you can have a massive impact on the outcome of the match. Don't go directly for the cap. Don't really try to duel yourself with destroyers or with patrol boats. That's just a waste of your potential. You always have to focus the enemy heavy cruisers, the enemy ships that have considerable amount of firepower and or armor, and then you are also a little bit of a team player in this respect. And especially if you take 3 of your friends also in Admiral Hipper in a platoon, that is absolutely nasty. But still, you have to hope that some of your teammates actually hop into some patrol boats and capture in certain game modes that capture points. Otherwise, you will lose the game before you can make a decisive impact on the game by killing the entire enemy of the player base, or killing the entire enemy player base. So that's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed Drachinifel's 5-minute guide. Link to his awesome channel in the video description down below. If you like this video, why not give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see each other on the battlefields, in the skies, and on the waves of War Thunder.